Salutations, Swift students. This is Prof. Gene and the immortal words of the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want. Sometimes in programming, you think you're going to get a legitimate value, and what you end up with is nothing. Well, in Swift, the absence of a value is called nil. It's different from zero or the empty string. Nil is a complete absence of value, a black hole with no data in it, and we're going to learn how to deal with nil results in Swift using the very swifty but somewhat tricky concept of optionals. Now, while optionals aren't common in most programming languages, learning to deal with them will make your code more reliable and will make you a better programmer. In this lesson, we're going to cover optionals. We'll talk about force unwrapping with the exclamation point and how to do this safely by checking first for a nil value. We'll learn how to deal with optionals using if-let, guard-let, and the double question mark nil coalescing operator. And as a bonus, we'll throw in how to use the Apple function trimmingCharacters. Now, we'll work in the playground so this lesson can be watched as a standalone video for anyone wanting to learn more about optionals, but if you're coding along building the Word Garden app, we'll also use the techniques from this lesson in the lessons that follow. Big learning is not optional. Let's code. So here's the problem we're trying to solve. We can currently type more than one character into the text field, but we only want one character at a time, because the user just guesses a single letter. Now, it's a little hard to see, but if the letter I is typed over and over again, you see how you can see more than one letter I in the text field here? So we're going to want to grab the last character that the user has typed each time the user types a character. Now, we're also going to have to deal with the fact that if the user presses delete over the last character, then there is no character in the text field. So if we ask for the last character, we might get a character, but if there's the empty string, we might get nothing. And in Swift, nothing is called nil. Now, dealing with this something or nothing occurrence is where optionals come in. So let's describe the concept in a bit more depth and build your programming skills. Now, in order to make sure that we understand the concepts, we're going to work in a playground. So let's go up under File, select New, and then select Playground. This will be a blank playground. Click Next. What do we call this? Optionals. I'm going to save mine to the desktop. Click Create, and expand the window to take up the full screen. Now, in our Word Garden app, we use a variable named guestLetter to hold the value that the user enters in the text field. So to simulate this in our playground, I'll just change the variable name to guestLetter, and I'll set this equal to Swift in all caps. Now I'll do a quick shift return at the end of the line here to make sure that my playground is working okay. And I can see over here on the right-hand side, the word Swift shows up. So that says, yep, this is working. So strings aren't formal arrays, but they do have some of the characteristics of arrays. And one of those is the calculated property count. So if I use guestLetter.count, just like I would with an array, then press shift return, we get the number 5 over here on the right, telling us that there are 5 characters in the string Swift. Now again, strings aren't full-blown arrays, so we can't say text square bracket 4 close square bracket and do a shift return. We'll get an error that says subscript is unavailable, you can't subscript a string. All right, I'll delete this line and click the stop and play button in the bottom above the console to clear out the errors. But what we want in this example is the last character, and the way that we could do that is use this calculated property last. So if we say dot last here, we see code completion says this gives us the last element in the collection. A string is a collection of characters. And look at what else we see up here. We say this returns a character, so it's important it doesn't return a string. We'll have to deal with that. But then there's also this question mark in here. What's up with that? Well, sometimes we ask our code to come up with values, and there might not be any value. That's what the question mark refers to. And the last property is a good example of that. If we say guestLetter.last and guestLetter contains the word Swift, then we get the letter T. But if we say guestLetter.last and we're trying to do that on an empty string, there is no last character in the empty string. We're going to get nothing. Let's see this in action. I'll do a shift return. T shows up here on the right. And so let's test out the example of the empty string. I'll just say guestLetter equals empty string. Then I'll write guestLetter.last, shift return. And I see nil over here on the right-hand side. Nil means nothing. You want the last character? I got nothing for you, because there is no last character. And just an important distinction in here, if I type in nil equals empty string, shift return, I get a false on the right-hand side because nil is distinctly different from empty string. Empty string is something, it's a string with nothing inside of it, but that's considered to be a legitimate string. Also, if I type nil equals 0, shift return, that's false too. So nil is not 0. 0 is a valid number. Nil is no number at all. Just a black hole, a void, nothing inside of it, an empty box. Now let's see what happens when we print this stuff out. We'll say print, parens, double quotes, in between the quotes, we'll type the last letter in, and then we'll say string interp, which is slash open and close parens, is string interp slash open and close parens, and then we'll go back. I'll put single quotes around the last string interp. I don't need that, but it'll help it stand out a little bit better. And in the first string interp, I'll put in guest letter, and in the second string interp, I'll put in guest letter dot last. And when I press shift return, whoa, look what I see down here. The last letter in Swift is optional T. I didn't put the word optional in there. What's that all about? Well, remember when we were looking at code completion for the dot last property, we saw that this returns a character question mark. Over to the slides. The question mark after character means character is an optional. That means that this value last here might return a character, or it might return nothing. It might return nil. Now, sometimes you hear of optionals referred to as a value being optionally wrapped. If it helps, you can consider this to be like an outside box around your value. If you look inside the box, you might see a legitimate value, a character, or you might look in the box and you might see nothing, nil. Now, when we had said print guest letter dot last, and we saw optional, the wrapper around the result. How do we get rid of the wrapper? Well, one way is we can force unwrap the value, and we do that with an exclamation point. That throws away the optional wrapper, and it gets at directly what's inside of it. So that's why we've got this square bracket here just around the character part, not in the optional wrapper. See down here, guest letter dot last exclamation point prints out just the lowercase o. Since in this example, guest letter contains the word hello, and no word optional is around it. Cool, so let's use that. Now there's going to be a catch with nil, and I'll show you that in just a bit. So you see down here in our output where it says the last letter in Swift is optional T. Let's get rid of the optional. What we'll do is we'll go up here and put an exclamation point just after the last property in guest letter. Then I'll click below line 11 and do a shift return, and we see the optional goes away. It says the last letter in Swift is T. Nice! So let's do the same thing down below for our empty string. I'm going to copy this whole line 6 here. I'll paste this at the end of my code, do a shift return, and oh! I get a fatal error, unexpectedly found nil, when unwrapping an optional value. Remember, when we put the exclamation point in there, we say throw away the wrapper, look at what's inside. If we expect a character to be returned and it's not, we get an error. That's a type-safe programming language in action. Nil ain't no character type. Error. Let's see how we can deal with this. So if the problem we're dealing with is we're trying to force unwrap last when it's got nil inside, why don't we first make sure the guest letter dot last is not equal to nil. If it does not equal nil, then it's okay for us to go ahead and force unwrap it. If it does equal nil, we don't have a valid guest letter, so what we should do is just set guest letter equal to the empty string. Now there's one last bit of trickiness. Remember, guest letter is a string, but the dot last property gives us a character. See what we had in code completion over here? So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to convert that returned character to a string. That's why the word string is around here in parentheses. We could also use string interpolation for this too. Remember, that's just type conversion. We learned about type conversion in our lesson in our first app that was on types. Let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to first comment out this print line where I got the error, and then stop and start in the console to clear out any error messages. So we'll say if guest letter dot last does not equal exclamation point equal nil, open and close curlies, guest letter equals guest letter dot last exclamation point else, then in between curlies, guest letter equals empty string. And just to remind you, if you do a shift return here, you get an error, and the reason for that, remember, code completion for last says it gives us a character. Actually, it gives us an optional character. Guest letter, however, is a string, and remember, in Swift, we can't equate values that are not the same type. A string is not equal to a character. However, from our previous app, you know how to do type conversions in Swift. We can precede this by the name of the type. That would be string, wrapping the value in parentheses. Or you can use string interpolation, which wraps this in double quotes, and it's got a slash in front of the parentheses. Let's use string interpolation. Shift return down below. We've got no error, but let's put in a print statement here just to make sure. So we'll say print, guest letter now contains string interp. I'll put single quotes around the string interp, and in the string interp we'll put in guest letter. Then at the end of our code, do shift return, we get the output that we expect, empty string. Now another way we could deal with this is if let. Sometimes you want to do something with that unwrapped value, so it would help to create a constant that contains the unwrapped value if it's not nil, and that's what if let does. The way to read this statement is if we can create a constant, remember let creates a constant, from guest letter dot last, so guest letter dot last is not nil. then we're going to create that constant using the let statement, and that constant is going to be called last char. If we can do that, then we do what's inside the first set of curlies, and that last char has scope for the first set of curlies. It only lives inside that first set of curlies. But what we can do is convert it to a string and assign it to guest letter. Else, if we get a nil from guestLetter.last, then we couldn't create a non-nil value in last char. That means we don't execute the first set of curlies. We instead go into the else clause. You might not need an else clause, but in this case we do, because what we want to do, if guestLetter.last equals nil, then we want to set guestLetter equal to the empty string. So let's try this out. I'm going to highlight these 5 lines of the whole if clause, copy them with a Command-C, do a Command/ to comment them out. Then I'm going to paste this down below, and I'm going to make the change so the first line will read if let last char equals guestLetter.last. Then if this is true that I have a non-nil value, I can take this value last char that I just created and assign that to guestLetter. Now I'm going to get an error up here because last char is a character and I need to turn that into a string. So I'm just going to precede that with the type name string and wrap it in parentheses. Then do a shift enter down below. I get the same result that I had before, but instead of checking to see if text.last did not have nil inside, instead we check to see, can we create a constant called last char that is not nil? Let's copy and paste this so we can check the result when we have something inside a guest letter. So I'll highlight all this text here, Command-C, then I'll scroll to the top and paste it in just before I set guest letter equal to empty string, and I'm just going to cut out the in guest letter part of my print statement here since I set the guest letter equal to my last letter, which would be T. Then if I do a shift return here, my code will execute through line 13, but the second time, if I scroll to the end and press shift return at the end of my code, when guest letter had an empty string in it, then this whole if let clause returns empty string. If let working great in both situations. And hey, up here, let's prove that last char only has scope in the first set of curly braces. So if down below here in my line 13, I type in print and then in between the parentheses start to type in last char, you see how the constant last char doesn't show up in code completion? That's because Xcode tells me, hey, last char doesn't exist outside of the curlies. I'll delete this line, go back up here in between the curlies, and in this positive condition here, if I can create last char, I can type in print, open parens, and if I start to type in last char, sure enough, it shows up in code completion. That means it has scope inside these curlies, but not outside. If I delete this, then try to see, hey, is last char down here in the else clause? And no, it doesn't show up in code completion. So again, that constant that we create via if let only exists inside the first set of curlies. Now you might also remember when we covered playing sound in our previous app, there was also a guard let statement. And if you finished that app, you wrote this code here. Well, here's a function using guard let in the context we're working on now. This function accepts a string, and then it's going to return the last character in that string if there is one. Otherwise, it's going to return an empty string. And as a reminder, guard let tries to create the constant. In this case, it's trying to create a constant named last char. And if it can, then it skips the else clause after the guard statement, and it continues for the rest of the function with last char having scope for the entire function. But if the attempt to create the constant last char fails, and that would be because text.last returns nil, then we execute the else clause after the guard statement and we'll return inside here, passing back the empty string. So let's code this together in the playground and try it out. So let's create a function with guard let that replicates these 5 lines of the if let statement here. So we'll create that function, we'll call it func, return last char, in between parentheses, we'll use a parameter called text, which is a string, and then we'll enter the arrow symbol and we'll return a string, and then in between our curlies, we're going to say guard let last char equals text.last else open and close curlies. Now if we fail the guard let test, if we can't create last char because text.last gives us a nil, then we're going to return the empty string. Otherwise, we've successfully created last char, we'll skip this else clause and we'll return, we have to put string around last char because last char is going to be a character, but that'll return a string containing the last character of whatever string we passed into this function. Then let's test this out. We'll create 2 constants. How about let swift last equals return last char, and we'll pass in the text swift, all uppercase, and we'll create another constant let empty last equals return last char, and we'll pass in the empty string. Then we'll print swift last equals string interp swift last, and then we'll print empty last equals string interp, and I'll put single quotes around that, empty last, then shift return, we see swift last equals t, empty last equals empty string. If you got that result, hopefully that means you've conquered guardlet and you know how to use guardlet to work with optionals. Now this last technique I'll demonstrate is called nil coalescing, and it looks a little weird. It's an operator with 2 question marks, but the way we read this is if we can perform the operation to the left of the double question marks without returning a nil, then we treat that result as if it's a forced unwrapped optional, so we'll get a result that's not optionally wrapped. But if we do get a nil from the stuff to the left of the double question marks, then we use whatever's on the right of the double question marks. So in this example, we try to use .last on guessed letter. If it works, guessed letter is the last letter, no optional unwrapping. But if .last returns a nil, then we skip what's on the left of the double question marks, we move to the right of the double question marks, which means we're going to return a single space. That's what's between the double quotes. Now another thing to note in this particular example here, .last returns a character, remember that down here, but in this particular line of code, we want to assign that value back to guessed letter, which is a string. So we've got to convert the result of the nil coalescing statement to a string. That's why we surround it by parentheses preceded by a string. Now you might also wonder, hey, why didn't we use an empty string in here instead of a space? Well, the 2 values on either side of the nil coalescing, the double question marks, need to be of the same type. So the unwrapped .last returns a character, which is a separate type in Swift, and that's different from string. So a valid character in Swift is a single character. If we tried to use an empty string, this wouldn't work, because an empty string is not a single character. The empty string doesn't have length 1, it has length 0. And if we tried that, we'd get an error. Now I'll also show you a nice iOS technique that we can use to get around this problem. Let's head to the playground to be sure we understand nil coalescing. So in our optional playground, I'll enter a print statement and I'll put a \n here to give me a line feed, and I'll call this the nil coalescing example, and then we'll set guessed letter equal to Swift, all in capital letters. Then we'll use nil coalescing to get the last letter of guessed letter and update guessed letter so that it only contains the last letter. So we'll say guessed letter equals guessed letter.last, then double question marks, and then a single space between double quotes. So the way this works is if we can get a non-nil value for guessed letter.last, then we'll use that letter unwrapped, no optional around it. But if .last gives us a nil, then we'll use the single space that's at the right of the double question marks, the nil coalescing operator. Now also remember, .last returns a character. See this in code completion? But if we option click on guessed letter, oh yeah, that's a string. We can't assign a character to a string. In Swift, you can only assign values that are of the same type. So we need to convert the character to a string, and we can do that by wrapping the entire nil coalescing statement in parentheses and putting the string keyword in front of that, capital S. Now we can also wrap the result of nil coalescing in a string interpolation. Either way will work. I'll use string interp here just to demonstrate it. Then below this, I'll say print, and in quotes, guessed letter equals string interp with single quotes around it, guessed letter. And if I run this code with a shift return, I can see that guessed letter equals T. Nice. But if I set guessed letter equal to empty string, then copy these 2 lines of code, paste them down below, and do a shift return, I can see for the second option, guessed letter equals a single space. Now let me show you this slick trick in iOS that we can use to trim out any extra spaces that exist in a string. This is often handy because if users are entering something like an email address, if they have any extra spaces at the end, you'll want to strip those values out. Same kind of thing if they enter a phone number. iOS has got your back. This is the command we'll use. It's a method called trimmingCharacters. It's an Apple method, so it's available for Mac, iOS, iPad, but it's not part of core Swift. Here's Apple's documentation on the function. It operates on a string and it returns a string with a character set trimmed out. Now Apple gives us a bunch of handy character sets that we can use. If I click on character set here, I can see that I can pass in any of these values to trim them out. I can trim out the alphanumerics, capital letters, control characters, decimals, lowercase letters, so many options. And the one we're going to use here is white spaces and new lines. We could also use just white spaces, but this is going to trim out any white spaces, meaning space characters that are in our string. And the trimmingCharacters method is super useful. We're going to be using this more in WordGarden to make sure that anybody playing our game will only enter letters. But for now, let's use this to trim out any space that might have been returned by our previous nil coalescing. So in the playground before our last print statement, I'll enter guest letter equals guest letter dot trimming characters. Now notice code completion says that this returns a string made by removing any characters from the ends of the string that are in the character set. So let's press return to accept this, and our friend dot notation in Xcode will pull up the available character sets. And if you wanted to, you could roll your own character set, but we want to use white spaces and new lines. Now mine is at the top because I've already used this when I've coded, but you might have to scroll below. You might find that in alphabetical order, but you've got it in there. Find it and press return. Shift return to execute this code, and look at that, Swifter. We no longer have the single space in our last print statement. We've got an empty string. Nice work! You now know how to deal with optionals. Our big learning covered the tricky concept of optionals. You learned about force unwrapping with an exclamation point, and you learned how to do this safely by making sure a value does not equal nil. You learned how to use if-let, guard-let, nil coalescing, and the cherry on top was our bonus of using the iOS method trimming characters, which we'll also use later in our word garden app. Optionals are one of the trickiest concepts in Swift, so feel good about your learning, and feel free to come back to this video lesson if you ever need a refresher. Now in our next video, we're going to apply some of what we just learned in our word garden app. Keep hacking!